I'm going to do my best to walk us through kind of a family systems theory 101 for us, to try to help us to understand better how family dynamics come into play. So we all understand things about systems and how systems work. So for instance, because we happen to live in Robinson, we understand the system of how Hershey candy is made, right? That there is an entire system at work in the factory. And when it works well from start to finish, we are able to produce candy, and it's able to be packaged and ready to be sent out and all of those things. And a healthy system has every part of it that is actually at work the entire time. But at its core, systems are patterns that we observe between people and other phenomena. A systems theory, and we're talking about a family systems theory in particular here, is kind of a map or a story. And a systems theory is also a description of something that is happening. Families have their own systems that exist. And these systems are in play because each family member relates to other family members. And that web of relationships forms its own system. After all, a family is a context. And so if we really want to understand an individual, and in our case, if we want to understand a care receiver, then we also need to understand their context. And their context is not simply that one person who is sitting there in the room with you, it's all of the people that they are in relationship with. And their primary relationships are with the people who live in their homes, or are the people that they grew up with. And those relationships have a tendency to shape how we interact with other people as well. Every family member has a behavior that is interwoven with other family members' behavior, and everyone is interdependent and interrelated with one another. For the system to work, it requires all of us to play our roles in the system. So if we want to think about that, for instance, with the example of Hershey, the conveyor belt has a specific role that it is supposed to play, right? And as long as the conveyor belt continues to do what it is supposed to do, which is to move the candy along, then the system works. And if the conveyor belt breaks down, the entire system breaks down because it's no longer carrying out the function for which it is made. I want to share some important family systems terms with you. Don't feel like you need to write things down necessarily, because this is being recorded. The recording will be available for us later if you want to. I'll also happily make my notes available to you. I'm using a great book. I have lots of books on family systems theory, but the one that I'm using is called Systems Theory and Family Therapy, which is by Dorothy Beckfer and Raphael Beckfer. And it's a wonderful kind of introduction to the family systems theory. I have lots of books that are sitting on my bookshelves about how family systems theory works in churches as well. And so that's another place where we see systems at work. We see this in work environments as well, that the systems theory comes into play. But here are some important terms that I think we need to think about. One of which is boundaries. And boundaries are a repeated pattern of behavior that characterizes the relationships and values that define a family. So if we think about the relationship between a mother and a daughter, there are certain boundaries that define that particular relationship. The same would be true if we think about a relationship among cousins. perhaps, that there are boundaries that provide uh, a, a boundary or a definition to that particular relationship because there are patterns of behavior that are expected to occur in that relationship. There are different communication patterns that exist in family relationships. There are verbal communication patterns. Sometimes we call these digital patterns, and those involve, of course, language, whether that's spoken language or written language. There's also nonverbal, or what we sometimes call analog communication, and that involves things like the tone of our voice, or gestures that are made, or facial expressions, or posture, how we sit. If our arms are crossed, that communicates something. If we slouch in our chair, that communicates something. And that we have those kinds of communication patterns serve to reinforce those boundaries and those behaviors in the family system. As relationships develop, we become very sensitized to that analog or the nonverbal communication that comes up, and that we have expectations when people communicate in that way that tell us, for instance, that they are upset with us. If you see someone who has a nonverbal behavior or a particular stance, or you hear someone, for instance, let's say, I'm not going to pick on moms all day long, okay? I just want you to know that, but there are lots of issues between parents and children. And so if your mom, when you were growing up, for instance, constantly started a conversation with you where she was providing correction to you by providing a big exhale. Even today, if you hear your mother do that same nonverbal communication with you, you have kind of a programmed response. Oh, mom's upset with me. Oh, I'm going to get a lecture. We start to feel those kinds of things and to sense those kinds of things. There are some principles of communication that I think are important for us to understand. And the first one is that you cannot actually behave. Now that sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? But we're always doing something. We can't stop that kind of behavior. We'll always be behaving in one way or another. And so we have to continuously think about that. The second principle of communication is that somebody has to communicate. We all have to communicate. Sometimes we do that verbally, but we don't always communicate verbally, but we will always communicate non-verbally. The third thing is that a given behavior is not necessarily its true meaning, but it is that person's truth. And the way that we often describe that for folks is that someone's perception is their reality. Okay, how's everybody doing? Are we doing okay? Is it all making sense? Is it too much? Okay, we're okay so far. Good. Okay, so let's continue with some of these terms. There's a term called energy that's important for us to think about, because every family system has entropy, which is a lack of energy that is happening, or information. And every family system also has what's known as negative entropy, which is a movement toward balance of energy in the family. So energy either kind of goes or energy is moving us from one extreme where we feel it back toward the center. Equifinality tells us that there are many different paths to one outcome, and this is where we begin to define patterns of behavior in these relationships that we have in our families. Homeostasis is a state of stability that exists in a family system. Morphostasis means that there is stability within change, and morphogenesis means actual change. Healthy systems, healthy family systems, are not about homeostasis at all, but they are about morphogenesis and morphostasis. So the system is constantly needing to change if it is a healthy system. When there is no change, it is an unhealthy system. One last set of terms which have to do with systems are open systems and closed systems. And these are boundaries that are set up around family members. So we may have an open system of communication that exists between mother and daughter, and mother and son, and daughter and son. Or we may have a closed system of communication where the mother and daughter communicate with one another, but mother and son do not have an open system of communication about what's happening between mother and daughter. And so we can have either an open system or a closed system in those individual relationships in a family, but we can also have that happen between a family and other systems. So you could have an open system between the family unit that lives in a home that is closed off to a family member's work system. Does that all kind of make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if people are in a healthy family system, the people who are in the system will grow and change. As they go through life, they will grow and they will change. And as a result of them growing and changing, their behavior will change, which then causes a shift to happen in the system. So for instance, we grow up in a household of family members, and let's just say for the sake of argument that our family system is that we each grew up in a household where we had a mother and a father and a sister and a brother. Okay, so a household of 4 persons. And as you were growing up in that household, the household system, by its very nature, defined those relationships in terms of we have a marriage relationship, and we have a parenting relationship, and we have a sibling relationship. And the ways that we function in our relationship, particularly between parents and children, in a healthy system, changes over the course of time. The way that we relate to our children, for instance, when they are 2, it should be different when we relate to them when they are 10. And it should be different, again, when they are 16, when they are 21, when they are 30. The system should be constantly changing because the nature of those relationships should be changing and shifting. If that is unhealthy, for instance, let's just stick with mother and daughter. If mom has not actually shifted in the way that she relates to daughter, and continues as daughter moves into adulthood to treat her as though she were 6 years old, that begins to develop an unhealthy pattern, and an unhealthy family system in which daughter is physically changing, daughter is emotionally changing, daughter is probably moving out of the house,
Mm.
and yet mom is still treating her like she is a young child instead of treating her as an adult. And her interactions are with her daughter in that same way. That forms an unhealthy relationship and an unhealthy system. But if everything changes normally, and let's say, for instance, that as this daughter moves into adulthood, the daughter may come to mom and ask for some advice, as she prepares to get married, as she prepares to have her first child, but they begin to become friends instead of just a relationship that looks like mom knows everything, daughter knows nothing. Daughter cannot function in the world without mom. To we can function as whole human beings, but we also have a good relationship with one another that does not look the way that it did 30 years ago. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, very much.
Okay. So that happens in a healthy family system. And the system then, because these people that are in the system are changing and they are growing, the system also adapts to these changes that happen in individuals as they grow and as they change. And that allows the system to actually flourish. What we discover, and I think that this could be said for almost every caring relationship that we will discover in Stephen ministry, and perhaps is also the case for all of us, is that there are also unhealthy places that exist in family systems. That happens sometimes because there are people who have not grown and have not changed and are trying to hold on to the system as it once was because they do not wish to have that kind of growth and they do not wish to have that kind of change. And so those people who exist in the system will resist the change that other members of the system are trying to make. So let's say, for instance, that you're working with a care receiver, and the care receiver that you're working with has functioned in their family system for a very long time as the person who is always going to solve everybody's problems. And as you're working with your care receiver and you realize that this is what is going on with them, and you're trying to help them to understand that they don't have to function in that particular way, that nobody's asking them to do that, and that's a very unhealthy role to actually be in the family, because there's a huge amount of burden and a huge amount of stress that gets placed upon that person. And as you work with them, they decide that they don't want to live into that role in their family system anymore. And so the next time that they have an interaction with someone in the system who comes to them and says, you know, we need you to take care of this, nobody else can do this like you, and they say no, that's a shock to this system that is unhealthy. And so what tends to happen then is that people, so for instance, the person who came to your care receiver and said to them, I need you to do this, nobody else can do this, may push back at that no and say, but I really need for you to handle this, and begin to butter them up, and to tell them how valuable they are, trying to get them to stay within the system. And sometimes that will actually happen. The person has not had enough of an opportunity to have that change, or to have that idea in their head cemented enough, that they'll just go right back into the pattern of behavior that they had before. And if they go back into that pattern of behavior, the system itself doesn't change. But if they say no and they hold that boundary and they refuse to participate in that, refuse to be walked all over, refuse to be put in that kind of a position, and they do that with consistency, you know what that does to the rest of the system?
Changes it.
It forces the rest of the system to change.
Mhm.
Someone else in the system either has to pick up that behavior that your care receiver is no longer willing to do, or they realize that that behavior doesn't need to exist. And it can force the entire system to change and become more healthy. Sometimes the closed system that I was talking about a little bit earlier closes out the opportunity for other family members to interact. So a mother and a son have a very close relationship to one another. They talk on the phone with one another every day, sometimes multiple times a day. They're obviously very close to one another. But in the process of doing that, the sister observes this behavior and hears how often those phone calls are happening, and discovers that mom doesn't call me, I don't call mom, I don't have that kind of a relationship with mom, and it begins to develop dysfunction because there are hurt feelings that are happening in there as well. That creates an unhealthy family system. When we have an unhealthy system and you have someone that you're working with that wants to become healthy and wants to be a part of a healthy system, we have to try to encourage them to do the thing that is healthy for them, and to maintain those kinds of boundaries that are healthy, because it will cause the system to change. So here's some things that I want to encourage us to think about as you're working with care receivers who want to have a healthy role in their family system and who want to have a healthy family system. The first one is to encourage their own growth and their own healing. Because after all, when they come to you, you are learning about their system, but your caring relationship is with your care receiver. And therefore, your focus needs to be on encouraging their own growth and healing. And as they experience that, and they make choices in their other relationships that are more healthy, they'll begin to create this new pattern for living for themselves. You can also try to help them to identify what their roles are in their family systems. You know, are they the scapegoat in their family? Are they the one who gets blamed for everything? Are they the nurturer? Are they the child who will never quite grow up, that needs pushing and that needs prodding? What are their roles in that system? And so that has to look at every relationship that your care receiver has in that family system, but also has to look at which ones of those are closed relationships and which ones of those are open relationships, and to be able to identify those things. When some sort of growth occurs for your care receiver, when change occurs for them, when they have a new insight as you're working with them, you want to encourage them to set healthy boundaries, because otherwise this unhealthy system that they've been a part of will try to draw them back into their former role. Another way of looking at this, which may make sense to us, is if you were to think about a marriage where there is physical abuse or emotional abuse that is going on, and the abuser will continue to function in that particular pattern, and the abused person may go and get counseling at some point in time, but let's say that the spouse hits the abused and then profusely apologizes. They're trying to keep that person in the system, right? And to keep that behavior going because they need them in there in order for that system to work. And when the person says no, then the abuser has to make a decision, or the person says, I'm leaving you, then the abuser has to make a decision as to whether they're going to allow that shift in the system and that growth to happen, or if they're going to act in some other way to try to bring that person back into the system. Does that kind of make sense as well? Okay. So other things that you can do are to try to coach folks, because when you're trying to set healthy boundaries, that's a very uncomfortable thing for folks who have not had healthy boundaries. And those boundaries have a tendency to become more permeable, and they need to be a bit more fixed. They need to not be penetrable by those people who are unhealthy in the system. You may also want to suggest to them that they continue to do some work with an impartial person who is outside of the family system, whether that is to continue to do work with you as a Stephen minister or to work with a counselor in order to maintain those boundaries that they're working on setting, and also to help to facilitate the healing that needs to take place for them and in some of those relationships. I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions that folks have, because I've just thrown a whole lot at you in the last half hour.
Is there a baseline for normal, or yeah, that's
Well,
no.
the baseline for normal means that the system functions in such a way that everybody is living out their full potential.
Okay.
And I think we can see this is helpful for us in terms of congregations and congregational ministry as well, because sometimes when we are trying to change an unhealthy system in a congregation, people's ugliness comes out in that, because they have a particular role that they're playing and they like the role that they are playing. And so one of the things that I've discovered over the years as I try to help systems function well in congregations is to make sure that people represent themselves. Because what tends to happen is that, let's say, for instance, we've decided that we are going to take the lot that we purchased a few years ago, and because there is a need that exists in the community to take care of the homeless in our community. And we want to do that by making sure that we are providing food and that we're providing a warming shelter in the winter. And so we're going to build a facility to do that. And so we've done a feasibility study. We think we have the money to be able to do that. We have the support of the elected leaders of the church to do that. And someone who is not in support of taking care of people who are homeless doesn't think that that they need to be taking care of themselves, that is not the responsibility of the church to do that, comes into my office and they say to me, everyone in the congregation is upset about this and nobody wants to do this. What do you think I should say to them? Who is everybody? I'm going to need a list of names, because if there are people who are upset, I'm going to need to contact them and provide them with pastoral care. And you know what happens when you say something like that to them? There are no names, because they have overgeneralized their own opinion in order to try to keep the system the way that it is.
Mhm.
And when we disarm them from doing that and do that consistently, it takes away their power or their perception that they actually have power to hold the system in place or to hold the system of the church hostage. And we have to think about all sorts of things like that. Family systems teach us about things like that there are people who overfunction and there are people who underfunction. So there are people who will let are part of the 80% who will let 20% of the people do all of the work. And there are 20% of the people that are perfectly willing to do all of the work and overfunction on behalf of everyone else. And we see that at play in families as well. That's another place where things get out of balance. And we need to have everybody living fully into their potential.
Mm-hmm.
I said I was going to let you all ask questions, and now I'm just sitting here babbling, so I'll stop. Questions that you have, insights that you have. Or are we just sitting here taking it all in?
Soaking it up.
Soaking it up.
Add, Pastor Jay, that I think this would be a place that would be easy for, when it's easy on somebody looking in on somebody else's situation to really see what's going on, and really can see clearly what's going on. But at the same time, so it'd be easy to offer advice or tell people what to do. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember for the care receiver, whoever you're working with, to understand that their situation for themselves. And also to sometimes they may say, well, I want to set up these boundaries, and you might coach them on that. But at the same time, we need to make sure, we're not in those systems. right? And we don't know all the roles and we don't know all the particulars, how it works. So to make sure that it's going to be an appropriate way for that person to handle that or to communicate that with other people in their system, that's going to work. Does that make sense? Most effective.
Absolutely.
So that's just
So
something,
what,
you know, like when I'm using example of school, if I'm working with kids at school on something with families, I'll say, well, you know, we'll be talking about something, but I'll say, well, how will that play out if you do this? Or have them kind of brainstorm, well, if I say this, what's going to happen? Or if I do that, what's going to happen? And so that they can be in control of the situation and do it in the way that's most effective and healthy for that person. That makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's an opportunity for you to ask more questions rather than provide solutions. So I think of things like, you know, to ask the person, when something like this has happened with this family member in the past, what has their response been? And then to build upon that and to say, if you were to respond in this way, how do you think they might respond?
Yep.
And how would you feel if that was their response? And if their response was different than that, how would you feel then? Because it gives them the opportunity to wonder what it would look like to function differently in a different system.
if you were, I can already think of some times in our supervision group that this information that you've given us would be a helpful thing in getting care receivers to be able to speak and start to analyze their situation and help them. Like, for example, do you think it would be appropriate to say to people, care receivers that are having trouble, you know, how about if we get a piece of paper and we list or make some sort of ask them to draw their family, who's in it, you know, and then maybe talk about each person's dynamic and where they are in that dynamic so that they can begin to understand if that's maybe part of the problem. Do you think that would be an appropriate way to approach this? What would be appropriate?
Well, I think part of what we have to do is reflect back to our care receivers. And so I think something that might be more appropriate, especially early on, as you're working with your care receiver and you're getting to know them and you're building a trusting relationship, is that as you're talking with them about their family, that you sketch out these relationships. And then when you feel like you have a decent introduction to all of these relationships, to say, I've kind of been trying to track everything that you've said, and this is what I think I've heard you say. Do you think this reflects what you've said about your family and about these different relationships? And you can actually show them your chart, however you chart out their family tree and all of the different branches and how that works together. But I think that's important for them to be able to correct things, because you're supposed to be able to reflect this back to them. That's part of the art of listening.
Yeah, I think that, Yes, and then maybe give it to them and say, work on that. Work on fixing what I mixed up before next session or something like that. I could see how that would be. Make sure that you're saying to them, this may not be right. This is what I heard you saying. How could you fix it? Or are there changes that you need to make? There are several times when we've been in supervision that I feel like that would have been a helpful thing to give someone as an idea.
And if you have that charted out and it's been corrected by the person, that also gives you an opportunity to check in perhaps with them. If you feel like maybe we don't have a whole lot to talk about in this particular caring session that we're doing together, you could ask about one of those relationships. Well, how is your relationship with your uncle right now? A few times ago, you kind of talked about that, and you said that things were a little bit strained there. And I'm wondering about what that's like now.
That's good information, I think. And the fact that there's no prescription. That's another question you could ask. Do you feel like you're at a healthy place in your family dynamic? Could you ask that? Do you feel like you're?
I think if you were getting further in your relationship, perhaps, I'm not sure that that's a question that I would ask, in your first 3 months of a caring relationship, because it may take that long for them to actually reveal an issue that exists in that relationship.
I think sometimes some people don't, and Becky, you can talk about this too, when we used to work with girls in the jail. I'm not sure everybody always understands what really healthy relationships are or aren't. And sometimes they may be in patterns with their families or other relationships that they might not realize are unhealthy, right? They might have something going on, but it may take them a while. And so even asking them in general, sometimes depending on the situation, what they define as a healthy relationship between whoever, if it's a mom and a daughter, or taking it away from them to see if they can define that. We do that too at school a lot when we're talking about kids dating and things. Well, what do you think, what makes a healthy relationship with a significant other? And then sometimes they can see that what's going on in their life, because it takes the focus off of them a little bit too. I think it depends on who you're dealing with and what the issue is.
Yes, there is no one size fits all when it comes to this, because every family system is different. Which is also a good reminder for us that we can't put our own family system, as healthy or unhealthy as it is, over the top of our care receivers and expect the family system to look as ours does, or for it to look like the model healthy system, because they're all unique. Other questions or observations?
was going to say, sometimes perhaps with the care receivers too, you know, they've married into a family whose system is very different than the system they grew up in. And trying to find your place in the system, that makes sense. Yeah, a whole new system has to, yeah. Because you come with different system backgrounds.
Mhm. Yeah, and sometimes when you're the outsider in that manner of speaking, you can effectively change the system for the better just by your mere presence. I'm known to do that in my future in-laws family by saying things like, "Now, why do you choose to do that?" In my best counselor voice. Or, did you know that you don't have to do that? That you don't have to respond in that way? I don't encourage everyone to respond as I am, but, you know, I am myself unapologetically. And I bring that to my relationships, so.
I feel
I think
sure
that's a good
that
thing.
they love you because of it.
Amen, Becky.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Because you dare to step out there and say it.
Well, they're going to be stuck with me in 4 months, Becky. No matter what.
I know, so they better learn to, yeah. They better embrace it.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's not any, it's hard for families to even see what their dynamic is. I mean, I think most of them wouldn't have a clue, you know, and then when you join two families together, there are things that are very blatant to you as a new person. And you can ask and try to figure out in a way that's that you're trying to fit in, but sometimes they don't see you that way.
Yeah. And that's the thing about in-laws is that you are coming into a system in which you have never had a role. Right? You come
Yeah.
into that system, which can either be a closed system or an open system, but you've not had a role with mom, you've not had a role with dad, you've not had a role with siblings. And so your mere presence shifts the system because there is not a predetermined role for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What else? Anything else?
Would you call this the basis for, I mean, really the basis for all relationships? Well, the family dynamic. I guess I'm focusing just on that.
Yeah, every relationship has dynamics, whether they look like a traditional family set of dynamics. You know, you could take a family system and overlay it at work.
Mm-hmm.
Right? and you would have people that are functioning in different roles and in different responsibilities, and somebody that's in there serves as the scapegoat, and somebody in there functions as the person that everybody runs to with their problems. And this happens in all sorts of facets of life.
It's interesting.
I will make a couple of orders of some resources on family systems for us to add to the Stephen Ministry Library. So if you're looking for more information, I think that I'll choose the resources that will serve best for us as people who are engaged in caring relationships.
That's awesome. Thank you.
That'd be great.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Is the one you mentioned that you are looking at for tonight, is this still being published, do you know?
It is. It's in its 3rd edition right
Okay.
now. And so it was copyrighted in 2018.
Okay.
And
That would
it's
be-
literally called Systems Theory and Family Therapy, a primer.
Oh, great.
You think if someone wanted to, like me, if I wanted to buy that, it might be a good place to start to have my own library?
Yeah.
Okay. And then carry it around to the family dinners?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Great little name tags,
Uh-huh. I think that would be wonderful.
I'm gonna be very popular.
Wait a second. You put, what's that game? You put it on our back and we can check who we are.
Yeah. But you don't do name cards for place settings. You put the role,
Oh, there you go.
and then they have to try to figure out who they
Figure it
are.
out. Love it.
That's what you do in family therapy, right, Jay? If the whole family's there?
Yes.
I think it's very interesting. I think it's really interesting to look at it using the word system. It really is. I
I
mean,
never thought of a family as a system before.
but it makes sense.
It makes perfect sense when you hear it all together, but I never would have thought of it that way, no.
Yeah, you think of dynamics and roles, but
Yeah.
But all of that adds up to a system.
Well, yeah, but I never thought of it as a system.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I
that is-
hope that this has been helpful for all of you, and that it will help you in your caring relationships.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank
thank you. Thank you very
And
much.
thanks for putting it in terms that we can all understand, what I mean, because I think a lot of that theory stuff can be challenging to understand, and that was very good how you explained it.
Mhm.